The old meadow, a wide carpet of green and gold tucked between gentle rolling hills, was Isabella's favorite place in the entire world. It was a place that felt separate from time, where the only sounds were the buzzing of lazy bees and the cheerful chirping of crickets hidden in the long grass. On this particular afternoon, the sun was warm and generous, pouring its light over everything and making the petals of the wildflowers seem to glow from within. Isabella sat in the very heart of this peace, a small wooden easel planted firmly in the soft earth before her. She was carefully trying to capture the way the light danced through the leaves of the ancient oak tree that stood as a silent guardian at the meadow's edge. Her brush, a tiny stick of wood and hair, moved in delicate strokes, mixing colors on her palette to create the exact shade of purple she saw in the clover blossoms. She was so completely lost in her work, in the simple joy of creating something beautiful, that she didn't notice the first subtle change in the air. It began with a quieting of the bird's song. The cheerful symphony that had filled the meadow slowly dwindled to a few scattered notes, and then to an uneasy silence. A cool breath of wind, a stranger in the warm afternoon, rustled the tops of the tall grasses, making them sway like a restless sea. Isabella looked up, her paintbrush pausing mid-air. She watched as a dark, purplish-gray cloud began to swallow the bright blue sky on the horizon. It moved with a swift, determined purpose that felt threatening. The air grew heavier, pressing down on the meadow, and the temperature seemed to drop several degrees in a matter of moments. A deep, low rumble of thunder rolled in the distance, a warning drumbeat from the approaching army of clouds. A knot of anxiety tightened in Isabella's stomach. She had been so eager to paint that she had ignored the morning's forecast for potential afternoon storms. Now the storm was no longer potential, it was imminent and it was moving fast. She scrambled to her feet, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. The wind picked up, no longer a gentle rustle but a determined gust that whipped her hair across her face and made her easel wobble dangerously. She had to pack up and she had to do it now. She quickly screwed the lids back onto her little tubes of paint, her fingers fumbling in her rush. She dropped a tube of brilliant cobalt blue, and it vanished into the thick grass. There was no time to search for it. The first cold, fat drops of rain began to fall, splattering against her canvas and leaving dark, blurry marks on her painting. The sky was now a deep, bruised color, and the world around her was plunged into a strange, eerie twilight. The wind howled, tearing at her clothes. She grabbed her canvas from the easel and shoved it into her large canvas bag along with her paint box. The metal legs of the easel were slippery with the now falling rain as she tried to collapse it. Another crack of thunder, much louder this time, exploded directly overhead, making her jump and let out a small, frightened gasp. The rain intensified in an instant, transforming from a few warning drops into a relentless, blinding downpour. In seconds she was soaked to the skin, her light shirt and pants clinging to her hair plastered to her head and neck. She had to get to shelter. The old oak tree was the closest cover, but she knew it was the worst place to be in a lightning storm. Her car was parked nearly half a mile away, down a narrow dirt path that was already turning to mud. She decided to run for it. Slinging her heavy bag over her shoulder and clutching the collapsed easel under her arm, she took off, her shoes slipping on the wet, treacherous grass. The world was a chaos of wind, water, and roaring noise. She could barely see 10 feet in front of her. She was running, her breath coming in ragged pants, when her foot landed on a hidden, muddy patch. It slid out from under her with terrifying speed. Her arms flailed, the easel flying from her grip as she fell hard onto the ground, a sharp, hot pain shooting through her right ankle. For a moment she just lay there, stunned and breathless, the cold rain pounding down on her. The pain in her ankle was intense and throbbing. She tried to push herself up, but the moment she put the slightest weight on her right foot, the pain flared so brightly it made her cry out and collapse back into the wet grass. Panic, cold and sharp, began to rise in her chest, mixing with the physical pain. She was alone, hurt, and trapped in the middle of a furious storm. She dragged herself, crawling on her elbows and knees, toward the relative shelter of a large bush, her bag and easel abandoned behind her. She huddled there, shivering uncontrollably from the cold and from fear, clutching her injured ankle. Tears welled in her eyes, mixing with the rain on her face. This was bad. This was very, very bad. It was then, through the sheet of gray rain, that she saw a shape moving toward her. At first it was just a blur, a darker shadow in the storm. Her fear spiked. Who or what was out here? As the figure came closer, it resolved into the shape of a man, a very tall and broad-shouldered man. He was wearing a dark jacket that was soaked through, and his hair was matted to his forehead. He moved with a powerful, determined stride against the wind. Isabella shrank back, pressing herself against the bush, her heart hammering against her ribs. He saw her almost immediately, his gaze locking onto her huddled form. He changed his direction and came straight toward her, his steps quickening. He knelt down in the mud beside her, his face level with hers. He wasn't handsome in a polished, city way. His face was strong, with a firm jawline shadowed with stubble, and his eyes were a deep, serious brown, but they held no threat, only a calm, steady concern. "I saw the storm coming and was checking the fences for my sheep," he said, his voice a low, calm rumble that somehow cut through the noise of the storm. "I saw you fall." His eyes dropped to her hands, which were still protectively clutching her swollen ankle. "You're hurt." Isabella could only nod, her teeth chattering too much to form words. Without another word, he shrugged off his own wet jacket and in one fluid, surprisingly gentle motion, wrapped it around her trembling shoulders. The inside of the jacket was still warm from his body heat, and the small comfort of it was overwhelming. Then he carefully slid one strong arm under her knees and the other behind her back. "I'm going to get you out of this," he said, his voice close to her ear. He lifted her as if she weighed no more than one of her canvases. She instinctively wrapped her arms around his neck, holding on as he stood up, turning his body to shield her from the worst of the wind and rain. He then walked over, scooped up her fallen easel and canvas bag with a deft grab, and began carrying her, not toward the distant path to her car, but in the opposite direction, toward a soft, warm light that glowed like a beacon in the gloom. It was a light from the window of a small, sturdy-looking cabin she had never noticed before, nestled right at the edge of the woods. He was taking her to his home. The world outside the cabin door was a roaring, chaotic monster of wind and water, but the moment Alexander stepped across the threshold, carrying Isabella in his arms, that world was shut away, replaced by a profound and almost shocking silence. The only sounds were the frantic drumming of the rain on the roof and the crackling of a well-built fire that danced in a large stone fireplace, its warm orange light flickering across a room that was simple, sturdy, and deeply masculine. The air smelled of wood smoke, old books, and a faint, clean scent of pine. It was the smell of Alexander, and it was the smell of safety. He didn't put her down right away. He stood for a moment in the center of the room, as if deciding the best course of action, his eyes scanning the space with a practical efficiency. Then he moved toward a large, worn armchair covered in a soft, faded blanket that was positioned perfectly near the hearth. He lowered her into it with a surprising gentleness, his hands making sure she was settled before he released his hold. The warmth from the fire immediately began to seep through her wet clothes, a sensation so welcome it was almost painful. Isabella watched him as he moved through the cabin, his every action purposeful and unhurried. He was a man of few words, it seemed, his communication expressed through deed rather than speech. He placed her salvaged easel and bag carefully against a far wall, out of the way of the puddles already forming from their dripping clothes. He shrugged out of his own soaked vest, hanging it on a peg by the door, revealing a simple cotton shirt that was damp in patches. Without a word, he disappeared into a small adjoining room and returned with a thick, fluffy towel and a soft, gray wool blanket that looked hand-knitted. He handed the towel to her first, his brown eyes meeting hers for a brief, silent moment before he turned and knelt before the fire, adding another log from a neatly stacked pile, giving her a semblance of privacy. Isabella buried her face in the towel. It was clean and smelled of fresh air and sunshine, a relic from a time before the storm. She rubbed it vigorously over her hair and face, the rough texture a welcome feeling of normalcy. She then began to carefully dry her arms and neck, the simple act helping to calm her racing heart. When she lowered the towel, Alexander was standing before her again, holding out the wool blanket. "You should get out of those wet things," he said, his voice low and calm. He gestured toward the room he had just come from. "The bathroom is through there. You can hang your clothes on the hook. I'll find you something dry to wear." There was no suggestion in his tone, only a quiet, practical concern for her comfort and health. She nodded, feeling a blush creep up her neck. Using the chair for support, she hopped on her good foot toward the bathroom, a small, clean space with simple fixtures. She closed the door and leaned against it for a moment, listening to the storm and the muffled sounds of him moving around in the main room. She peeled off her soaked, cold clothing, hanging them clumsily on a single hook, and wrapped herself in the large towel. When she opened the door, she found a small, neat pile of folded clothing sitting on a wooden stool just outside. There was a soft, well-worn flannel shirt and a pair of sweatpants that she knew would be comically large on her. Hopping back to the chair, she managed to put them on, rolling the sleeves and the waistband multiple times until her hands and feet were free. The flannel shirt smelled overwhelmingly of him, that same mix of wood smoke and pine, and being enveloped in it felt strangely intimate. When she was settled back in the armchair, now wrapped in the wool blanket over Alexander's clothes, he approached again, this time carrying a small metal first aid kit and a basin of warm water. He knelt before her once more, his movements slow and deliberate so as not to startle her. "I need to look at your ankle," he stated simply. When she gave a small, hesitant nod, he so carefully lifted her injured foot and rested it on his bent knee. His hands were large and calloused, the hands of a man who worked with wood and earth, but his touch was incredibly gentle as he probed the swollen joint. Isabella winced, and his eyes flicked up to hers instantly. "It's not broken," he said after a moment of careful examination. "But it's a bad sprain. It will need ice and rest." He then took a cloth, dipped it in the warm water, and began to gently clean the mud and grass from her scraped skin. His head was bent in concentration, the firelight catching the subtle strands of brown in his dark hair. No one had ever taken care of her with such quiet, focused attention. It was unnerving and deeply comforting all at once. After he had wrapped her ankle in a firm, professional bandage from the kit, he moved to the small kitchen area. Isabella took the opportunity to truly look around the cabin. It was one open room with a sleeping loft accessible by a ladder in one corner. The walls were made of honey-colored logs, and they were mostly bare except for a few shelves filled with books and a single beautiful carving of a soaring eagle. There were no frivolous decorations, no photographs in frames. It was the home of a man who lived a life of purpose and solitude, a life of things that were necessary and true. Alexander returned with 2 steaming mugs. He handed one to her. It was heavy pottery warm in her hands. "Tea," he said. "With honey? It will help with the shock." She took a sip. It was hot and sweet, spreading warmth through her chilled core. He pulled a wooden stool near her chair and sat, sipping from his own mug, his gaze on the fire. The silence between them was no longer awkward. It was a quiet space, filled only by the dying sounds of the storm and the crackling of the fire. "My name is Isabella," she said softly, feeling the need to break the quiet, to offer something of herself in return for his kindness. "I'm Alexander," he replied, looking at her. A small, almost shy smile touched his lips for the first time. "Isabella." He said her name as if he were testing the sound of it, and she found she liked the way it sounded in his calm, low voice. "Thank you, Alexander," she said, her voice thick with emotion she hadn't expected to feel. For all of this." He simply nodded, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer before returning to the fire. "You can stay here tonight," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "The couch pulls out. It's comfortable. In the morning, when the storm has passed and you can put some weight on that ankle, I will drive you to your car." The decision was made, practical and final. Isabella leaned her head back against the chair, the warmth of the tea, the fire, and the dry clothes finally stopping her shivers. She was stranded in a stranger's cabin, wearing a stranger's clothes, her life and her plans completely disrupted. And yet, as she watched the firelight play across Alexander's thoughtful, quiet face, she felt a strange, new feeling begin to uncurl within her, a feeling of being exactly where she was meant to be. The first thing Isabella was aware of was not the familiar hum of her city apartment's heater, but the rich, melodic chorus of birdsong outside a window she did not recognize. Sunlight, clean and golden, streamed into the room, painting bright rectangles on the wooden floorboards. For a disorienting moment, she lay still, wrapped in the soft wool blanket on Alexander's pull-out couch, trying to place the scent of pine and the faint, comforting smell of last night's fire. Then memory returned in a warm rush. The storm, the fall, the strong arms that had carried her to safety. She sat up carefully, testing her ankle. It was stiff and throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, but the sharp, stabbing pain of the night before had subsided to a manageable discomfort. The cabin was quiet, and for a heart-sinking second she thought Alexander had left. But then she saw him, standing perfectly still by the large window, his back to her, looking out over the rain-washed meadow that glittered in the morning sun. He held a steaming mug in his hands, and the quiet peace of the scene made her feel like an intruder on a private ritual. He must have sensed she was awake, for he turned slowly. His expression was, as always, calm and unreadable, but his eyes were soft. "Good morning," he said, his voice a quiet rumble in the sunlit room. "How is the ankle?" "Better," she replied, her own voice still rough with sleep. "Still sore but better." He nodded, a single, efficient dip of his chin. "Good. I'll make breakfast." Then we can see about getting you home. The word home felt strangely hollow and distant. As Alexander moved to the small kitchen area and began the simple, practiced motions of making coffee and frying eggs, Isabella used the furniture to support herself and hopped to the small bathroom. Her clothes, though dry, were stiff with dried mud and grass. The idea of putting them back on was unappealing. When she emerged, she found another set of his clothes waiting for her on the stool, a soft t-shirt and a different pair of sweatpants. The quiet consideration of the gesture touched her deeply. After she had changed and managed to hop to the small wooden table, he placed a plate before her with perfectly cooked eggs and toast, and a mug of strong black coffee. They ate in a silence that was not uncomfortable, but filled with the newness of the morning and the unspoken question of what would happen next. It was Isabella who broke the silence. "Your home is so peaceful," she said, looking around at the sunlit cabin. "It feels solid." "It's been in my family a long time," Alexander said, following her gaze as if seeing it through her eyes. "My grandfather built it with his own hands. I promised him I would always take care of it." This was the most he had offered about himself, and Isabella held the information carefully, like a gift. After breakfast, he helped her to the armchair by the window, propping her injured foot on a footstool with a pillow. He brought her the canvas bag containing her painting supplies. "In case you get bored," he said simply before pulling on his boots and heading outside to tend to his morning chores. From the window, she watched him stride across the wet grass toward a small barn, his movements sure and capable. The day stretched before her, long and unscheduled. She opened her bag. Her painting from the day before was ruined, the colors blurred and smeared by the rain into a ghostly, abstract version of the meadow. She felt a pang of disappointment, but it was quickly replaced by a new impulse. She set up her easel, positioned a fresh canvas and began to mix her colors. But she wasn't painting the meadow outside. She began to paint the cabin's interior from her vantage point by the window, the sturdy log walls, the ladder to the loft, the way the morning light fell across the floor. She was so absorbed in capturing the play of light and shadow on the wooden rungs of the ladder that she didn't hear Alexander come back in. He stood behind her for a long time just watching her work. When she finally sensed his presence and turned, she saw a look of genuine awe on his face. "You're very good," he said, his voice filled with a quiet wonder she hadn't heard before. "You make my home look more like itself." The days that followed settled into a quiet, unexpected rhythm. Isabella's ankle healed slowly, and Alexander insisted, with a quiet firmness that brooked no argument, that she stay until she could walk on it properly. He drove to her apartment to fetch more of her clothes and her other art supplies. Her city life, with its deadlines and noise, felt a million miles away. In the cabin, time moved differently. Mornings were for painting, afternoons were for talking. She told him about her dream of having her own art show, the nervous excitement she felt when a gallery had finally said yes. He told her about the land, the names of the trees and the birds, the quiet satisfaction of caring for the small flock of sheep that were his responsibility. He showed her how to fix the wobbly leg on her easel, his large, capable hands handling the tiny screws with a patience that fascinated her. She, in turn, cooked meals for them with the groceries he brought from town, filling the cabin with smells that were new and foreign to it. One evening, as a soft twilight settled over the meadow, Isabella was standing at the sink, washing the dinner dishes. Alexander came up behind her to return his plate to the counter. He didn't move away. She could feel the warmth of his body close to hers, and the air in the room suddenly felt charged and still. She turned slowly, her hands still wet and soapy. He was looking down at her, his usual calm expression replaced by something more intense, more searching. The world seemed to shrink to the space between them in the dimly lit kitchen. He reached out and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek, his calloused thumb grazing her skin and sending a shiver through her entire body. He didn't say a word. He simply took her hand and led her from the kitchen, his grip firm and sure, toward the couch where she had been sleeping. The quiet between them was no longer peaceful. It was thick with a tension that had been building for days, a silent question that was finally being answered. He stopped and turned to face her, his eyes dark and serious in the fading light. He leaned close, his voice dropping to a hushed, intimate whisper that was for her ears alone. "I need to make love. Don't move or it'll hurt more, I'll be quick." The words were not a demand but a profound request for trust, a promise of gentleness wrapped in a warning not to startle, not to break the spell of the moment. He was asking her to be still, to let him show her the depth of what he was feeling without the interference of fear or pain from her healing injury. And in the quiet of the cabin, as the last light of day vanished, Isabella chose to be still, and to trust him completely. The world outside the cabin had never seemed more vibrant. To Isabella, the green of the meadow was a deeper, richer emerald, the song of the birds a more complex and joyful symphony. Her ankle had healed, leaving only the faintest twinge as a memory of the storm, but she found no urgency in the thought of leaving. The small cabin had ceased to be Alexander's home and had become theirs, a sanctuary woven from the threads of their shared days and intimate nights. She had set up a permanent painting corner by the largest window, her canvases leaning against the log walls, slowly filling with images of the land she had come to love as her own. There was one of Alexander, not a formal portrait, but a capture of his profile as he looked out at the sunrise, the light etching the strong, quiet lines of his face. There was another of his work-worn hands resting on the wooden table. She was painting the story of their life, and with every brushstroke she felt herself sinking deeper, putting down roots in this soil as surely as the ancient oak tree. Alexander, too, had changed in subtle, profound ways. The quiet solitude that had once defined him had softened, making room for her. He smiled more readily, a true, unguarded smile that transformed his entire face. He would often pause in his work to watch her paint, a look of quiet wonder in his eyes, as if he could not believe his solitary world now contained such color and light. He started talking about the future, using the word "we" with a natural ease that made Isabella's heart swell. He pointed out a spot near the edge of the woods where the sunlight was just right in the afternoon. "We could build a studio for you there," he said one evening, his arm around her shoulders as they watched the stars emerge. "A big one with windows on all sides so you could paint in any light." The idea felt less like a dream and more like a promise, a tangible future they were building together, day by peaceful day. This new, fragile happiness made the intrusion feel all the more violent. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, not with a storm but in the form of a sleek black car that kicked up a plume of dust on the dirt road, a stark alien presence against the rustic landscape. A man in a crisp, expensive suit stepped out, clutching a leather portfolio. He introduced himself as a representative of Granite Peak Development. His smile was wide and practiced, but it didn't reach his eyes. Alexander listened, his posture slowly stiffening, as the man spoke of vision and progress, of exclusive luxury properties that would capitalize on the breathtaking views. He slid a thick document across the wooden table. The offer was a number so large it was almost abstract, a sum of money that could buy a lifetime of ease, a fortune that would solve any problem a simple man could ever have. Alexander's response was quiet and immediate. "The land is not for sale." The man's smile didn't falter, it merely became tighter. "Mr. Ross, this is a life-changing opportunity. I urge you to take some time. Discuss it with your wife." His eyes flickered to Isabella, who stood by her easel, her paintbrush frozen in her hand. "There is nothing to discuss," Alexander said, his voice gaining a hard, flinty edge Isabella had never heard before. "I made a promise to my grandfather. This land stays in the family." The man left then, but the shadow of his visit lingered in the cabin long after the dust from his car had settled. It was a poison seed, planted in the fertile ground of their happiness. Over the next week, the letters began to arrive, each one upping the financial offer, each one more insistent. Then the phone call started, always during dinner, always with the same smooth, persuasive voice. Alexander would answer, his replies growing shorter and more terse, his knuckles white as he gripped the receiver. Isabella watched the change in him with a growing sense of dread. The relaxed, contented man she had come to know was being replaced by a tense, preoccupied stranger. He spent long hours walking the perimeter of his land, as if guarding it from an invisible enemy. He stopped talking about the studio. He stopped talking about much of anything. The quiet in the cabin was no longer comfortable. It was heavy and strained, filled with the unspoken weight of the decision hanging over them. The breaking point came on a night when the phone had rung 4 times. After the 4th call, Alexander slammed his hand down on the table, making the plates jump. "They won't stop," he growled, staring out the window into the darkness. "They think they can wear me down with their numbers." Isabella approached him carefully, placing a hand on his rigid back. "Alexander, it's just money. We have everything we need right here." She meant it. She had never felt richer than in this simple cabin. He turned to her, and the conflict in his eyes was a physical pain to see. "Is it, Isabella? Is it just money?" he asked, his voice rough. "This money could mean security. It could mean I could give you things. A real house, not just a cabin. A life without worry." His words felt like a physical blow. "You think I want a real house?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You think I worry here?" This is the only place I've ever felt truly safe. This land, it's part of us now. How can you even think of letting them pave it over for things? It's not about things, he shot back, frustration boiling over. It's about being practical. It's about facing the real world. Promises to ghosts won't stop these people. The word ghosts hung in the air between them, cold and final. Isabella stared at him, the man who had whispered such tender promises in the dark, and saw a stranger calculating a betrayal. The studio by the woods, the future they had painted together with their words and their love, it all seemed to crumble to dust in that moment. The shadow had not just fallen on the land, it had fallen between them, and it was a shadow she didn't know how to fight. Tears she could no longer hold back filled her eyes. Without another word, she turned and walked to the small closet, pulling out her suitcase. The silence was now absolute, broken only by the sound of her sobs and the zip of the suitcase closing. Alexander stood by the window, his back to her, a statue of his own internal war. He did not turn around. He did not ask her to stay. As she loaded her bags into her own car, the one that had sat unused for weeks, the cabin windows remained dark. She drove away from the meadow, from the oak tree, from the man she loved, believing with her whole broken heart that he had chosen the cold comfort of money over the warmth of their forever. The city was a cacophony that grated on Isabella's every nerve. The constant hum of traffic, the blare of sirens, the impersonal glare of streetlights outside her apartment window, it all felt like a harsh alien language she had forgotten how to speak. Her homecoming was not a return to normalcy but an exile. The silence in her apartment was the worst kind. It wasn't the peaceful, companionable quiet of the cabin, but a heavy, hollow emptiness that echoed with everything she had lost. She tried to paint, setting up her easel by the window that overlooked a busy street, but the magic was gone. Her brushes felt clumsy in her hand, the colors seemed dull and lifeless, and every stroke felt like a lie. The only image that burned in her mind was the meadow, the cabin, the way the dawn light caught the dew on the spiderweb strung between the tall grasses. She was painting a world she could no longer have, and her heart wasn't in it. The gallery owner called, excited about her upcoming show, but the news felt distant and meaningless, like it was meant for a different person, a person who hadn't left her heart in a cabin in the woods. Back in the meadow, Alexander was living in a different kind of silence. The cabin, once filled with the scent of her paints and the soft sound of her humming, had reverted to its old, stark self. It was no longer a home, it was a monument to his mistake. He had won his battle. He had called the man from Granite Peak Development and, in a voice stripped of all emotion, told him never to contact him again, that the land was his and would remain his until he was in the ground. He had kept his promise to his grandfather. But the victory was ashes in his mouth. He had defended the land and in the process had lost the reason it had ever mattered. He walked through his days like a ghost, the memory of Isabella's hurt and betrayed eyes haunting him every time he closed his own. He saw her in the chair by the fire, at the kitchen table, in his bed. He picked up the painting she had left behind, the one of his hands, and the quiet intimacy of it was a physical ache in his chest. He had been a fool, so blinded by a perceived threat that he had pushed away the only real treasure he had ever found. The day of Isabella's art show arrived. Her apartment was filled with her paintings, all carefully crated and ready to be transported to the gallery. They were the best work of her life, vibrant and emotional, but she looked at them with a numb detachment. It was the final task, the last thread connecting her to the person she had been before Alexander. As she was directing the movers, her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize, but the area code was from his town. Her heart leapt into her throat. It wasn't him. It was an older woman, a neighbor who had gotten her number from Alexander's phone book. "I hope you don't mind me calling, dear," the woman said, her voice kind. "But I saw Alexander at the post office. He looks terrible. He's like a shadow of himself. He didn't say it, but we all know it's because you're gone." The call ended, but the woman's words ignited a tiny, stubborn flame of hope in Isabella's darkness. What if his silence wasn't indifference? What if it was regret? The gallery that evening was a whirl of noise and light. Well-dressed people milled about, holding glasses of wine, their murmurs creating a low, buzzing hum. Isabella stood in the center of it all, wearing a simple black dress, a fixed, polite smile on her face that felt like a mask. They were all saying the right things: stunning work, such emotion, you have a brilliant future, but the words washed over her without meaning. She was pretending to be an artist, pretending to be happy, pretending to be whole. She was about to retreat to a quiet corner when the murmur of the crowd shifted. A path seemed to clear near the entrance and a hush fell over that part of the room. And then she saw him. Alexander stood in the doorway, looking out of place and overwhelmingly real amidst the polished gallery crowd. He was wearing a clean, simple button-down shirt, but his hands were shoved into the pockets of his worn jeans, and his boots were dusty from the road. His eyes scanned the room, frantic and determined, until they found hers. The noise, the people, the entire world seemed to dissolve into a blur around them. He began to walk toward her, his gaze locked on hers, his stride long and purposeful. The crowd parted for him, sensing the gravity of his mission. He didn't stop until he was standing right in front of her, so close she could smell the familiar scent of pine and open air that still clung to his clothes. The gallery was utterly silent, every person watching the scene unfold. Alexander's eyes were filled with a raw, unvarnished pain and a love so deep it stole the breath from her lungs. "Isabella," he said, his voice low and rough with emotion, but clear enough for her and everyone nearby to hear. "I was wrong. So terribly wrong. I was fighting for a piece of land, and I forgot that I was supposed to be fighting for us. The promise I made to my grandfather meant nothing if I broke the one I made to you with my heart. The land is just dirt and trees without you there to paint it, without you there to make it a home. You are my home." He slowly got down on one knee right there on the polished gallery floor. A collective, soft gasp rippled through the room. He took her hand, his own calloused and strong and wonderfully familiar. "I don't have a ring yet. I was in too much of a hurry to get to you. But I have a promise. A promise to spend every single day for the rest of my life making you feel as loved and as cherished as you make me feel. Isabella, you are my forever. Will you marry me? Will you come home and build that life with me in our cabin on our land?" Tears streamed down Isabella's face, but for the first time in weeks, they were tears of pure, untainted joy. The mask was gone. The pretense was over. She wasn't just an artist in a gallery, she was a woman being loved by her man in the middle of a crowd, and it was the most real thing that had ever happened to her. She looked down at his hopeful, earnest face, at the love shining in his eyes, and she knew with every fiber of her being that her exile was over. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking. Then louder for him and for the whole world to hear, "Yes, Alexander. 1,000 times yes." He stood and swept her into his arms, holding her so tightly it felt as if their two separate hearts were beating as one again. The gallery erupted into applause and cheers, but they heard none of it. They were in their own world, a world of forgiveness and future, of a love that had been tested and had come out stronger on the other side. They were married in the meadow, under the ancient oak tree, surrounded by the land that had brought them together and the friends who had watched their story unfold. Isabella's paintings of the cabin and the hills, now infused with an even deeper story of love and redemption, made her one of the most sought-after artists in the region. They built the studio by the edge of the woods, just as he had promised, and in the evenings, they would sit on their porch and watch the sun set over their land, their hands intertwined. The storm, the heartache, the shadow, it had all led them here to this perfect, peaceful forever. They had learned that love isn't about never making mistakes, it's about finding your way back to each other, no matter how far you've strayed. If you were moved by Alexander and Isabella's journey, if you felt your heart ache when they were apart and sore when they found their way back to each other, then you won't want to miss the next story. Our channel is dedicated to bringing you timeless tales of love, loss, and the courage it takes to fight for a happy ending. We have more stories of hearts mending, of promises kept, and of forever being found in the most unexpected places. Subscribe now and join our community of dreamers and believers. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new chapter of romance. Let us continue to explore the beautiful, complicated, and magical landscape of the heart, together.